At 2:16 on the morning of April 9, 1940, a freezing wind gusted off the Ofot fjord, carrying the scent of distant snow and diesel exhaust. Narvik, an iron ore port buried within the Arctic Circle, slept beneath a blanket of cold and silence. Norwegian sentries on the frost-bitten quays stared out into a darkness broken only by the scattered glow of navigation lights. Beyond the pier, black shapes loomed against the water, warships, moving closer, silent and sinister. Lieutenant Hans Øygard, 27 years old, hands numb from the cold and head clouded by exhaustion, stared through binoculars as the unknown ships edged into the bay. It wasn't supposed to be like this. April was meant to bring thaw and a sense of routine, not invasion. For generations, Narvik had been important for one reason: iron ore. Every winter the port stayed open while Swedish ore trains rolled down to the sea, feeding European industry. But now, that ore had become a prize for armies and a target for war. Øygard's orders had come at midnight: remain vigilant. But who did one watch for? Rumors in Oslo said the Germans were months away from any Scandinavian ambition. The Royal Navy was busy blockading the North Sea, and the French were still rebuilding from last year's disasters. It was supposed to be another Arctic spring. Instead, the world ended in a matter of minutes. At 2:22, the leading ship, its hull gray, guns masked, Nazi swastika barely visible in the Arctic gloom, cut its engines and swung broadside to the pier. Norwegian conscripts peered out, uncertain whether these strangers were friends or foes. The answer came with the sharp clap of rifle fire. German sailors, storming ashore without warning, shouting in clipped, urgent orders. Within moments, the old customs house was ablaze, the harbor thick with black smoke. The invasion had begun. Narvik had always been a crossroads for power. Its icy fjords had seen Vikings and traders, Russians and Swedes, but never the boots of a conquering army. Suddenly, its fate balanced on the edge of a blade. Narvik woke to a cold, gray dawn on April 10, 1940. The fires from the night before still burned, casting jagged shadows across the frozen harbor. The acrid scent of fuel and cordite mingled with the biting Arctic air. Lieutenant Hans Øygard's breath steamed inside his parka as he gathered the remnants of his shattered squad beneath a ridge overlooking the town. Only 19 men remained, bones chilled, spirits tempered by fear and determination. The arrival of British and French reinforcements the evening before was a sore balm in a freezing wound. Though exhausted from their sea crossing and mountain trek, the Allies were here, and they had a plan. The rugged terrain surrounding Narvik was as much an enemy as the German soldiers who held the town. Jagged peaks piled with snow and ice hemmed the harbor, channeling every movement into narrow, winding paths. Transporting heavy weapons through frozen marshes and steep ravines was backbreaking work. For the Allied troops, Norwegians, British Royal Marines, and chasseurs alpins from France alike, it was a battle of endurance as much as firepower. Captain Alan Brooke, leading a British detachment, wrote later that every step forward felt like a march through the jaws of a wolf. The iron ore train was Narvik's lifeblood, a winding snake of steel that threaded through the mountains toward Sweden's mines. Cut that line, and the Germans would be starved of ore, their war effort crippled before it began. Norwegian commandos set out on nighttime raids, sabotaging tracks, blowing up bridges with demolition charges carried on their backs through waist-deep snow. Lieutenant Øygard joined them on one mission, a covert strike against a supply depot outside the town. The men moved like ghosts beneath a starless sky, their breaths holding quietly in the frigid air. Explosions ripped the silence open, rails bent and twisted like molten metal. Convoys stopped, stuck in frozen hell. For every bridge blown, every train derailed, German reinforcements grew more desperate. But the cost was high. On the return trek, An ambush wiped out half the unit. Øygard's squad barely escaped, their escape possible only by sheer luck and ruthless determination. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy was not idle. At sea, Admiral Whitworth ordered a daring counterattack into the twisting fjords, a lethal dance of destroyers and torpedoes. British ships crept through the ice-cold waters under cover of darkness, hunting alongside Norwegian gunboats for the German destroyers blocking Narvik's harbor. On the morning of April 13th, HMS Cossack and HMS Eskimo launched a surprise torpedo strike. Among the stunned Germans was Captain Bay, whose flagship was crippled and burning. A cataclysmic explosion ripped through the water as a torpedo found its mark beneath the hull. The battle for naval supremacy in Narvik's fjord had shifted. Back in the streets of Narvik, the German Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, had settled into defensive positions. Their knowledge of the terrain gave them an edge. They dug foxholes beneath snowdrifts, set up machine gun nests in ruined buildings, and patrolled rooftops dusted with frozen sleet. Øygard's group engaged in brutal urban combat. Rifle shots echoed off stone buildings, punctuated by bursts of machine gun fire. Men bled silently in alleys, faces pale under the dim winter sun. Norwegian and Allied troops pushed house to house, fighting for every street corner, every shattered window pane. The stakes were endless. Every day that Narvik remained in German hands was another day of iron ore rolling through the port, sustaining Nazi war industries. From the freezing trenches, Captain Brooke reported, frostbite and fatigue battered his men nearly as much as enemy bullets. Feeding and supplying his troops across such broken terrain was a logistical nightmare. The arrival of rain and thaw turned slopes into treacherous mud. Soldiers slipped on ice, frost-bitten fingers struggled to reload rifles, and the constant cold gnawed at morale. But the Allies endured, knowing the cost of failure could tip the balance of the war in Europe. Behind the lines, Norwegian resistance fighters relayed vital information to the Allies: German supply movements, troop concentrations, and patrol routes. Radio transmissions crackled through hidden transmitters, risking detection by German counterintelligence. One operative, codenamed Varg, slipped into Narvik dressed as a laborer, gathering blueprints of the German defenses. His reports allowed Allied commanders to time attacks precisely, striking when German units were weakest or most vulnerable. As April wore on, the battle escalated. Each side brought heavier weapons. British artillery crews struggled to drag mountain guns upward over frozen ridges, while German engineers fortified bunkers with steel and reinforced concrete. The unpredictability of Arctic weather added another peril. Sudden blizzards closed visibility. Supply lines froze. Radios went silent. Yet, beneath the constant threat of death, a quiet determination took hold among the men. A resolve that this isolated fjord town might define the fate of nations. The early days of April 1940 had tested the mettle of every soldier in Narvik and its surrounding mountains. But as the cold grip of winter began to yield to the slightest hint of spring, the battle intensified into a relentless contest of wills. The Allies prepared for a bold counteroffensive, one that would take them deep into the heart of the rugged Arctic terrain, and, if successful, strike a decisive blow against the German invaders. Captain Alan Brooke, commanding British forces alongside Norwegian mounts troops and French chasseurs alpines, knew that the coming assault would be as much a battle against nature as against the enemy. Weather conditions, unpredictable and brutal, could turn a well-laid plan into a catastrophe within moments. Snowstorms could erupt without warning, visibility would vanish, and hypothermia lurked behind every frozen ridge. Through frozen landscapes where avalanches had claimed lives before bullets could find their marks, the Allied troops began their uphill advance. The narrow mountain paths funneled soldiers into choke points, where German defenders waited in fortified bunkers. their machine guns and mortars loaded with deadly precision. Every foot gained was a drawn-out and costly struggle. Norwegian resistance fighters, intimately familiar with the terrain, played a crucial role scouting enemy positions and guiding the assault units through hidden trails and forested gullies, avoiding open exposures to German fire. These guerrilla tactics not only salvaged limited resources, but also lifted the morale of Allied troops, who saw hope in the resolve of the local population. At night, under the flickering aurora borealis, sabotage teams crept behind enemy lines, demolishing railways and communications, plunging German command into confusion. Each explosion echoed like the heartbeat of the resistance, signaling that Narvik's defenders would not surrender quietly. Meanwhile, at sea, the Royal Navy renewed its offensive. With careful maneuvering, British destroyers slipped through the narrow fjords, engaging German warships in fierce encounters where every torpedo and shell could decide control of this vital port. The sinking of multiple German destroyers crippled the enemy's naval presence, weakening their supply lines and morale. Despite mounting losses, German forces held fiercely. Captain Erik Bay directed counterattacks with ruthless efficiency, pushing Allied troops back on several furious occasions. The mountains echoed with the thunder of artillery, the crackle of rifles, and the anguished cries of the wounded. Amid the carnage, Lieutenant Hans Øygard and his men fought valiantly, their knowledge of the town's labyrinthine streets and alleys giving them an edge in urban skirmishes. Despite dwindling numbers and scant supplies, they refused to yield. Their courage forged a symbol of Norwegian resistance against overwhelming odds. As days bled into weeks, the battle for Narvik became a crucible not only of military strategy, but of endurance, sacrifice, and the unyielding spirit of those caught in the frozen wilderness. A fight that would reshape the course of the war in the north. The battle for Narvik entered its most brutal phase as Allied forces launched a full-scale assault into the heart of the German defenses. Snow still blanketed the steep mountain slopes, turning every movement into a perilous climb, and every position into a deadly trap. British artillery units struggled to drag their heavy guns through ice and mud, setting up firing positions among the jagged rocks. Their shells tore through German fortifications, silencing machine gun nests one by one. But the enemy's tenacity only grew fiercer. Norwegian troops, joined by French mountain soldiers skilled in cold-weather combat, pressed into the town itself. Urban warfare turned the streets into ruins, with every shattered building becoming a fortress and every alley a battleground. Lieutenant Hans Øygard led his dwindling squad in hit-and-run attacks, using their intimate knowledge of Narvik's labyrinth to outmaneuver the occupiers. At sea, the Royal Navy delivered a decisive strike. Under cover of darkness, British destroyers penetrated the fjord's defenses, launching torpedoes that crippled the remaining German destroyers. One by one, the enemy vessels exploded into towering columns of fire and smoke, sealing the fate of Germany's naval presence in Narvik. But victory came at a steep cost. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were lost to gunfire, frostbite, and exhaustion. Supply lines stretched thin, and both armies grappled with the merciless Arctic environment as much as with each other. For the Germans, this was a fight not just for control of a strategic port, but for survival. For the Allies, it was a turning point, a hard-won demonstration that the Nazi advance could be stalled and reversed, even in the most hostile of settings. As the sun barely rose over the snow-dusted peaks, the stage was set for the final, decisive battles that would determine the future of Narvik and the broader war raging across Europe. April deepened into a relentless confrontation as the Allies and Germans fought bitterly for control of Narvik's surrounding mountains. The terrain transformed into a frozen maze of narrow ridges, icy ravines, and caves where every inch was contested with rifle fire and hand-to-hand combat. British and French troops, trained for alpine warfare but unprepared for the merciless cold and treacherous footing, advanced slowly against seasoned German mountain infantry. Artillery bombardments shook the frozen cliffs, sending showers of ice and rock onto enemy positions. Yet each assault met fierce resistance. Communication lines snapped under the strain of snow and sabotage, forcing commanders to rely on runners and radio operators, often exposed to deadly fire. Supply convoys struggled through muddy, rutted paths, and frostbite claimed more casualties than bullets, as the bitter Arctic winter clung stubbornly to the land. Lieutenant Øygard found himself on the front lines of a critical assault aimed at severing the German hold on the main railway line. His squad crept through frozen forests, exchanging suppressed shots with enemy patrols, moving inch by painstaking inch closer to their objective. Meanwhile, German forces were not idle. Reinforcements trickled in by sea and air, and their engineers constructed elaborate defensive works, bolstering bunkers with steel plates and digging tunnels into the mountainsides. Each fortification forced the Allies into costly, grinding battles where every meter gained was soaked in blood. The clash of wills, endurance, and strategy in the mountains of Narvik would have far-reaching consequences, demonstrating the challenges of Arctic warfare and the limits of early World War II Germany's expansion. As April turned to May 1940, the battle for Narvik reached a critical juncture on the icy waters of the fjord. The Royal Navy, determined to break Germany's grip on this strategic port, prepared for one of the most daring naval engagements of the war. Under cover of dawn's dim light, British destroyers and cruisers moved stealthily into the narrow fjord, aware that German torpedo boats and shore batteries awaited them. The waters were treacherous, lined with hidden reefs and sharp cliffs that left no room for error. The clash was sudden and brutal. Explosions lit the cold air as torpedoes tore through the still waters, detonating in fiery blasts under the hulls of German ships. British gunners fought fiercely, their shells smashing enemy vessels amid clouds of smoke and fire. Admiral Whitworth's fleet succeeded in sinking or crippling much of the German flotilla, tipping the balance of power in Narvik's harbor. But the fighting cost lives. Many British sailors were lost to both the guns and the unforgiving sea. At the same time inland, Allied forces seized the momentum. Norwegian, British, and French troops pressed their assault against weakening German positions, disrupting supply lines and forcing the enemy into retreat. Lieutenant Hans Øygard, though wounded from earlier skirmishes, remained determined. He led reconnaissance patrols to exploit gaps in the German defenses, relaying vital information that shaped the final push. The naval victory, combined with the grinding land offensives, marked a turning point in the fight for Narvik. It showcased the ferocity and complexity of Arctic warfare and underscored the Allies' growing ability to challenge German advances on multiple fronts. With the German naval force in tatters and their mountain troops increasingly isolated, the Allies seized the moment. The final phase of the Battle of Narvik began with a relentless push to drive the enemy from the town and secure control of the vital iron ore supply. Allied artillery pummeled German positions from elevated hillsides, while infantry units advanced cautiously through snow-packed streets and shattered buildings. The bitter cold clawed at exposed skin, and every foot of ground was won only through fierce combat and grim determination. Lieutenant Hans Øygard's squad played a crucial role in these closing actions, conducting daring raids against supply caches and communication hubs, sowing confusion among the defenders. Each successful mission tightened the noose around the remnants of the German garrison. Despite dwindling supplies and mounting casualties, German commanders refused to surrender. Fortified in their dwindling strongholds, they waged dogged resistance, determined to delay the inevitable even as their situation grew desperate. Yet, the tenacity of the Allied forces, bolstered by steady reinforcements and a decisive naval blockade, wore down the defenders. By early June 1940, German command ordered a withdrawal, and the remaining troops evacuated under cover of darkness. Narvik was liberated, its frozen fjords silent again except for the echoes of battle and the whispers of a war far from over. The victory carried strategic weight far beyond the Arctic Circle, signaling the first major defeat for Nazi Germany and inspiring hope across occupied Europe. The liberation of Narvik sent shockwaves through the war's early months, reshaping strategies on both sides. Beyond the immediate tactical victory, the battle exposed the limits of Germany's northern campaign and underscored the resilience of Allied cooperation under the harshest conditions. In London and Paris, military planners studied the lessons from Narvik, how terrain, weather, and determination could blunt even a ruthless, mechanized enemy. Joint operations between British, Norwegian, and French forces highlighted the necessity of multinational coordination for future campaigns. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the defeat prompted a strategic reassessment. Hitler recognized the vulnerability of extended supply lines and the dangers of underestimating local resistance and environmental extremes. The German High Command adjusted their priorities, diverting troops and resources to shore up threatened fronts elsewhere. Narvik's success also buoyed the morale of occupied nations. News of the Arctic victory reached resistance fighters across Europe, a beacon that defiance was possible, that the Axis advance was not unstoppable. Yet the war was far from over. The bitter fight in Norway was but a prelude to the grueling years ahead, where lessons learned in the snow would be tested again on battlefields worldwide. The daring battles around Narvik left a legacy far beyond the fjords and mountains where soldiers fought and died. The tactics developed in the Arctic, combining naval strikes, mountain warfare, and coordinated multinational attacks, would ripple through future campaigns across Europe and beyond. Key among these innovations was the integration of intelligence and local resistance networks, which significantly enhanced the Allies' ability to navigate hostile terrain and disrupt enemy logistics. Norwegian commandos, local guides, and Allied reconnaissance pilots worked in concert, setting a standard for future joint operations in challenging environments. The soldiers who survived Narvik carried their experiences into new theaters, trained in endurance, survival, and guerrilla tactics that proved invaluable. Lieutenant Hans Øygard's leadership and the sacrifices of countless unnamed men became the blueprint for the resistance spirit that fueled the liberation efforts across occupied Europe. For the German military, the harsh lessons of Narvik forced a cautious approach in later campaigns, famously influencing decisions in the Eastern Front, where terrain and weather posed similar challenges. Beyond strategy, the battle shaped personal stories of courage, loss, and resilience. These men, both Allied and Axis, faced not only the enemy but nature itself, confronting freezing temperatures, endless darkness, and isolation unlike any other. Narvik's forgotten saga endures as a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and fight amid the most unforgiving conditions, a hidden chapter in the vast epic of World War II. The Battle of Narvik remains one of the most remarkable and overlooked episodes of World War II. Though fought in the shadowed reaches of the Arctic, its consequences radiated far beyond the snow-covered fjords. Narvik demonstrated the crucial impact of geography on warfare, the way harsh landscapes could shape strategies, define tactics, and break even the most formidable forces. The lessons learned here echoed through subsequent Allied amphibious assaults, mountain campaigns, and joint operations. Lieutenant Hans Øygard and the soldiers who endured Narvik's bitter cold and relentless combat left a legacy of courage and innovation. Their struggle was a powerful reminder that victory often required more than firepower. It demanded resilience, adaptability, and unity against overwhelming odds. In the broader tapestry of the war, the battle helped stall the Nazi advance in the north, disrupted vital resource lines, and inspired hope across occupied nations. Yet for decades, Narvik lingered in obscurity, a forgotten fortress of sacrifice and determination. Today, as new generations revisit the frozen hills and fjords, Narvik's story stands as a solemn testament to those who fought in unseen places, often forgotten, but never truly lost to history.